in the text that we've written for Cambridge University Press, we focused on making sure, firstly, that using historical sources as evidence really did underpin everything that we did here. So one of the things that you'll notice if you look through is that whichever history chapter you're looking at, using historical sources as evidence is always present as an area that students focus on to develop their historical reasoning in this way. So this is a part from the Year 7 textbook, which introduces students to this concept. And as you can see here, it introduces students to the idea that there is different kinds of sources, like primary and secondary sources, and what are the key features of these sources. But what we also found was a useful approach was that for each unit that we look at, that it focuses on some of the other concepts as well. So for example, here is Unit 1, which just focuses on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and cultures. And as you can see here, this introduces students to that concept of sequencing chronology here. So what it means and how it might be useful. And as the text progresses, for example in Unit 2, where you can study either Egypt, Greece or Rome, all three of those options within that unit focuses on different concepts. And the same for the third unit when looking at China or India. But what we've ensured that is as students go through whichever options they do, Egypt, Greece or Rome, or India or China, that they are exposed to learning opportunities for all of the different concepts that are present there. So this, for example, is how the Victorian curriculum focuses on, I've just picked chronology as the concept, sequencing, and this is from the Year 7, the Level 7 and 8 descriptors with the elaborations, but as you can see, just focusing on the descriptor, sequencing events, significant events in chronological order to analyze the causes and effects and identify continuities and changes. And you see there some of the links between the concepts that chronology feeds into, things like continuity and change and cause and effect. And then beneath that, describe and explain broad patterns of change over a period from the ancient to the modern world. So really demonstrating there that simply sequencing events in chronological order is the beginning, not the end of how this concept gets used. So let's look at a couple of examples of how this actually plays out. So here's an example that comes, and the examples I'll use today are from the Year 7 chapter on First Australian History. So we've got here a activity box from that which focuses on this concept and skill of sequencing chronology here. And as you can see here, it says a key skill all historians need to have is how to put events in the order that they happened. When you do this, it's easy to see patterns and detect how things have changed over time. So really showing here that close link between what we've written here in the text and the curriculum, the Victorian curriculum here. So the student actions here, create a timeline from what you've read so far, and this is really the beginning information about migration, First Australian migration to the continent, looking at how that developed over time. And it says here, from the information in the timeline at the start of the chapter, make sure you outline the key phases that Sahul, the supercontinent there, went through tens of thousands of years ago. So again, making that link back to the curriculum, that chronology is useful for identifying phases of time. If we look down at the second and the third actions for the students to do, question 2, use the timeline you've created to write a short paragraph that explains the phases that the Sahul continent went through. So again, use of those chronological models like a timeline in order to be able to infer and understand things like phases within history, phases of time. If we look at the last action here for students, describe the impact these changes might have had on Torres Strait Islander peoples and cultures, Islander peoples living during those times. So again, looking at the idea that these changes had causal impacts on people. So just like the curriculum identified, there's links here going forward. If we look at the other, so for this chapter, this first chapter of Year 7s, it's obviously focusing on chronology, but as all the history chapters do, it focuses on the idea of using historical sources as evidence. And so here's a student activity from just later in that chapter. This requires the use of both the information that they've read through, but also the use of this visual source, this wonderful painting here from Joseph Lycett. And it gives contextual information to this particular visual source. So Joseph Lycett was born in England in 1774, an artist who specialised in painting landscapes. Lycett was transported to Australia as a convict, arrived in Sydney in 1814. So this is providing students with all that contextual information to understand the origin of this. After he was pardoned, he painted several famous scenes showing the cultural activities of Aboriginal peoples. Then it's got obviously the image here, and then it has two student activities here. The first one was the artist who painted source 1.15. So who was, that should be, the artist who painted source 1.15? How might this answer the question? How might the answer to this question, affect the ways the events were painted? So the fact that he is European means that students are beginning to understand that because he's not of the first Australian cultures, he is looking at it as an outsider and beginning to infer how that affects how he represents these things. And you've got here, using the information you have read and the painting, explain how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples used fire to help them hunt animals for food. And there's a lot of contextual information in this section of the textbook which they need to link in then to the source. So providing context for the source and making that link between them, that's there. And as it says here, please refer to the specific parts of the painting in your answer. And so just to sort of end this brief explanation here, a lot of the curriculum itself and how we've written a lot of the work here in the textbook is based on a lot of work from historical thinking research. So you may be familiar with work of Canadian researcher Peter Seixas and that really great book he wrote with Tom Morton on the Big Six historical thinking concepts. Then also some other work that comes here from people like Stefan Levesque and Sam Weinberg and others here. These influenced how the curriculum was taught, and then the curriculum was constructed, and then how also we went about the construction of this student resource to really try and make it based on the best research in this area. Thank you.